Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stacy, and I handle adult education here at the North Carolina Museum of History. And we're so glad that you're joining us for today's program, History at High Noon, the determined story of North Carolina's first Congresswoman. We ask that you please type any questions that you have for our guest speaker into the chat function located at the bottom center of your screen. At the end of our lecture, our adult programs intern will ask you as many of the questions as time allows. Additionally, we'd like to remind you that signed copies of Jane Pratt, North Carolina's first Congresswoman, are available in the museum shop. You can grab your copy by coming into the museum or shopping online at ncmuseumofhistoryshop.com. So it's my honor to introduce and welcome our speaker today, Marion Elliott Deerhake. Environmental scientist, historian, and author Marion Elliott Deerhake provided North Carolina with the first book about Jane Pratt. Deerhake completed her undergrad in chemistry at Salem College and her master's in environmental chemistry at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Her biography of Pratt was published in April 2024. It showcases the long-lasting federal impact of the state's first female representative. So Marion, the floor is yours. I'm going to turn it over to you. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Stacy, and my thanks to the museum, and hello, everyone. I'm excited to have this opportunity to share Congresswoman Jane Pratt's story with you. She's a forgotten woman in North Carolina history, elected in 1946 as our state's first woman to serve in Congress. Did you know it took an additional 46 years to elect a second North Carolina woman to Congress? She was the Honorable Eva Clayton, the first African-American woman elected from North Carolina, winning the race for the first district in northeastern North Carolina in 1992. As I write in the book, time has forgotten the late Congresswoman Jane Pratt, her service to North Carolina, and her political and professional journey as a woman in the early 20th century. She was not destined to become the first female member of the U.S. Congress, but she was prepared. Her path to office was not typical of other women in Congress, but it was the straightest and most logical. Jane Pratt was a Southern woman ahead of her time. She embodied the new self-reliant female who gained the right to vote in 1920. As a single woman, she learned quickly how to build the essential skills needed to become self-sufficient. Her passion for politics, more than 2 decades of experience working daily in Congress, and her incredible recall of constituents' names and needs set the stage for her becoming, as some might call her, the accidental Congresswoman, quote unquote. She was a secretary who won a landslide special election with a budget of only $100. Tracing Pratt's path to a seat in Congress gives us a realistic look at how difficult it was for women to gain political leadership roles in North Carolina and the country in general throughout the 20th century. The biography of Jane Pratt is not only intended to tell readers about her journey, but also to depict the lives of women in the federal workforce and the hard-fought progress toward equality they sought. Jane exemplified the grit, determination, and resilience of a single Southern woman. Although she had limited higher education, she made up for it with plenty of real-world legislative experience, her ability to successfully serve North Carolinians with common sense, political savvy, and people skills, and her desire to advance the welfare of others.
Marion, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but your slideshow isn't advancing on our end.
Okay, I'm about to change it right now.
Okay, just want to make sure. Thank you.
This is just my introductory slide.
Gotcha. Okay, good deal. Thank you.
So to understand how Miss Jane, as they called her, became the overwhelming choice for the U.S. House in 1946, we need to understand her early life and her career path. So here we go. Now we got it. How about that? Can you see it?
That looks
Okay,
beautiful.
great. Okay. Jane Pratt was born in 1902 in the little town of Morgan in southern Anson County, just this side of the South Carolina state line. The fifth of 7 children, 5 girls and 2 boys, her family farmed for generations. Her father decided to move his young family in 1911 to Rayford in Hoke County to start a new career. You see, Rayford had been settled by the Presbyterian Scots, and it was growing rapidly, both economically with the railroad and as a respected educational center. Jane once said that her father had two loves, the good earth and good education. He started a mercantile in town and other ventures, including farming, to support the large family. He may have also aspired to match his in law's success in retail, the Belk family of Charlotte. Or James may have moved to Rayford because he knew the odds of all five of his daughters getting married were slim. So he may have wanted them to receive good educations and become self sufficient women, such as teachers and nurses. His foresight was correct. Only two of the five girls ever married. Around 1916, the Pratts sent Jane more than 200 miles away to the Asheville Normal School to board and study to become a teacher. At Asheville Normal, domestic skills training such as sewing and weaving remained a 2-year course for those wishing to specialize in that area. And during those years, North Carolina experienced a world war and two natural disasters impacted Asheville seriously: the 1918 Spanish flu and the historic 1916 flood. The flood killed more than 80 people, washed dozens of homes off their foundations, and stranded parts of Buncombe County from railroad service, which was destroyed. Damages totaled about $3 million in 1916. That's over $89 today. The influence the flood and the pandemic had on Jane appeared to surface in later years, as shown by her passion for public service. Years later, Jane told a reporter that she realized while at Asheville Normal that teaching was not what she wanted. She transferred to Queens College in Charlotte, where she hoped to pursue a music degree. However, her dream of a music career came to a sudden stop when her father fell ill. Jane knew she had to help support the family, so she announced plans to withdraw from Queens and go to secretarial school. However, one well-connected faculty member knew Jane had the ability to do much more. Addie Williams Caldwell, wife of Charlotte Observer publisher Joseph Pearson Caldwell, and a newspaper columnist herself, helped Jane become one of the first women newspaper editors in the state, managing the Montgomeryan in Troy. Her publisher must have given Jane considerable decision-making authority. That's because, in addition to Jane firing the weekly paper's only printer soon after she arrived, it's evident that he gave Jane the freedom to select stories and opinion pieces for the paper. You'll find example selections from a 1922 edition of the Montgomeryan in the book. While at the Montgomeryan, Jane particularly impressed one man and his wife who were the publishers of Asheboro's Courier newspaper, William and Minnie Hammer. William Hammer was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1921. Minnie, a mover and shaker in her own right, ran the paper, among other activities, while her husband was in office. The Hammers were so impressed with Jane when she covered his speech at the Candor Peach Festival in 1923 that he invited her to come to Washington, D.C. and work for him as his secretary. Jane was the first woman known to serve on the North Carolina delegation's staff. Even the congressional secretary's position was commonly staffed by men at that time. Jane was entering the rapidly expanding post-suffrage federal workforce in 1924. She was excited about being part of a modern progressive city such as Washington, D.C., and she followed style and fashion trends and made what was a major cultural decision of her time to cut her hair into the newest style, a bob. She said Congressman Hammer was so shocked when she arrived at his office with her bobbed hairdo, he exclaimed, "No telling how many votes that's going to cost me." He added that he'd better not see her smoking a cheroot, which is a cigarette. Calvin Coolidge was president in 1924, and Prohibition was in place, but pretty much ignored in Washington, D.C. Upon arrival, Jane began night classes in secretarial school while she worked days on Capitol Hill. During the Coolidge years, I found a newspaper story that she escorted a group of visiting students from Women's College, UNCG now, to the White House. The students and Jane met with President Coolidge in his office. This was just one example of the level of access Jane had to high-ranking officials. Her responsibilities and her amazing network in DC continued to grow over the next 2+ decades. I learned quickly that while researching Pratt's career, it would require studying the 5 congressmen she supported, including their politics, policy interests, and achievements. That's because Jane was devoted to her work and her bosses. Between 1924 and 1946, time and again, she supported them through the Great Depression and World War II as they negotiated and voted on bills related to economic recovery, social welfare, agriculture, international relations, veterans affairs, food security, and labor. In the book, I write about early to mid 20th century North Carolina history through the federal lens to highlight the state's most pressing issues of the time. The federal programs and funding authorized during those years were essential and groundbreaking for the state's future, pulling it out of a poor agricultural economy into a more prosperous industrial era. Between 1924 and 1946, Jane worked across 4 presidential administrations for a series of 4 congressmen from the 7th District, which later became the 8th. William Hammer, who I mentioned earlier, was also an attorney and former educator. Hinton James, Scotland County banker and farmer, and great-grandson of the University of North Carolina's first enrolled student. Walter Lambeth Jr., Thomasville furniture executive, decorated World War I officer, and London educated, and William O. Bergen, a Lexington attorney and bank executive. Congressman Hammer died in office unexpectedly in 1930, leaving Jane to operate the office as leaders back home in North Carolina selected a replacement, Hinton James, to complete the term. After managing James' office, Jane next had to run the transition for incoming Congressman Walter Lambeth of Thomasville. Lambeth and Jane were both Roosevelt Democrats. Jane was eager to support FDR and his New Deal visions through her work for Lambeth, who was a favorite congressman of Roosevelt's, I learned. The historic legislation that passed during the New Deal years laid the foundation for our nation and state's future economic and social policy, natural resources management, technology, and defense. During the Depression, United States unemployment rose from 3% of the labor force in 1929 to an unimaginable 24.75% of the force in 1932 and 33. Jane said in later years that she regularly had to say no to people who came to the office looking for jobs during the Depression. There were no quick answers to economic recovery. Among the legislation passed in the first 100 days of FDR's new administration were the Emergency Banking Act, Civilian Conservation Corps Act, Agricultural Adjustment Act, the Tennessee Valley Authority Act, and of course the Securities Act. For North Carolina, there were 2 major New Deal funded projects to note. First, the Resettlement Administration, a U.S. Department of Agriculture program, helped farmers and others in economically distressed rural areas improve lands for agriculture and natural resources management. This included a 60,000-acre site near Hoffman, North Carolina, that spanned multiple counties. It was named the Sandhills Project, and it included development and demonstration of new practices in forestry, poultry production, wild game enhancement, and aquaculture. The Resettlement Administration also set aside land for what is now Umstead State Park in Wake County. The second major project was construction of the Blue Ridge Parkway, and it's perhaps the most recognizable New Deal project in North Carolina. This was not in the district where Jane worked, but my impression was that Congressman Lambeth and she supported the project. While the Sandhills Project site has decreased in size and changed over the years, it's now managed by the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission. Umstead Park and the Parkway remain vitally important to our state. When Representative Walter Lambeth announced Unexpectedly, in 1938, that he would not seek a fifth term, Jane was named in a newspaper list as one of 16 potential replacements for the Democratic Party. She was at the top of the list, too. The other 15 people were men. After Jane announced that she did not intend to run, she remained the district secretary on Capitol Hill. And she once again transitioned the office for newly elected Democratic Representative William O. Bergen of Lexington. Congressman Bergen was in office beginning in 1939 as the U.S. remained neutral during Hitler's invasion of Europe. Then the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor in 1941. Jane attended President Roosevelt's speech calling on Congress to declare war. This was one of several historic speeches in Congress she attended that I write about in the book. As World War II consumed our time, resources, and hearts, so many Americans made sacrifices. Congressman Bergen poured himself into his work. He served on the House Foreign Affairs Committee during those tense World War II years. And the work stress took its toll on Bergen's health. 1946, he died in office at the age of 69. After Bergen's death in early April, the Congressional District's Democratic Party Executive Committee met on April 23rd in the town of Troy. They decided to hold a special election to complete Bergen's term. They scheduled the special election on the same day in May as the Democratic primary for the general election in November. The story of Jane's nomination for that special election was a real nail-biter, in my opinion. There was a 12-man executive committee representing the 12 counties of the district, which was quite large, stretching from Wilkes to Scotland County, basically along the Yadkin River Basin. There were 3 men at the courthouse vying for the nomination, but Jane was in Washington, D.C. with the flu. So 4 women from Thomasville drove to Troy to show their support for Jane. The committee voted on 7 candidates, Jane plus 6 men, including Major John Lang of Carthage, who was the campaign aide of Rockingham attorney and general election primary candidate Charles B. Dean. If Lang were to win the nomination, it would enable him to better position candidate Dean for the general election's Democratic primary win. Now, about the vote that day in Troy. The Wadesboro Messenger and Intelligencer newspaper reported, it became apparent that sentiment over the district was strongly in favor of giving the short term to an independent nominee who would thus be accorded the honor of serving in Congress without doing any serious harm to the primary candidate. On the 5th ballot, Davidson County Committee member George Hunley of Thomasville moved that Jane be nominated, and he encouraged his fellow committee members to vote unanimously for her. Yadkin County's G.C. Wallace cast the final winning vote for Jane as the Democrats' nominee for the special election. Committee Chairman Jacob Stewart sent Jane a brief telegram that day congratulating her on the nomination, and with that brief telegram, North Carolinians could finally see a clear path to including one of its daughters in Congress. One wonders, what if those 4 women had not attended the meeting in Troy? Would Jane have been nominated without their advocacy? Once news of her nomination for the special election was out, press had a ball reporting it. Headlines never before imagined were printed. Jane Pratt, happy and serene over nomination to Congress. Secretary will run for seat in House. Hail to Tarhelia's first Congresswoman. You see, Jane was the presumptive winner because the Democratic Party had dominated the district for years. Jane Pratt was such a unique female figure in the news that readers were eager to learn not only about her experience, but also her childhood and even her physical features, such as her height, weight, and shoe size. Readers were most curious about this tall, handsome, and stylish professional woman. Jane had only 5 weeks and no Democratic Party funds for the May 25th special election, so she self-financed her campaign with less than $100. The Chattanooga Daily Times quoted Jane as saying, "I'm no campaign orator, but I know how to ask for the votes." You see, she'd been doing that for years for her bosses. As she drove around the district asking for votes, one stop was in Sanford at the Sanford Herald newspaper. The reporter included in the story, humorously to me, that she wore a brown pinstripe suit with one of those high crowned hats, which was also brown, as were her bag and shoes. On May 25th, Pratt won the special election resoundingly, defeating the Davidson County Republican nominee. She carried all 12 counties, including the historically Republican Wilkes County. She won with almost 80% of the vote. Charles B. Dean secured the party's nomination in the general election primary, defeating Sanford publisher William Horner, but by only 354 votes. Jane was sworn into office on June 3, 1946, by the powerful Speaker of the House, Sam Rayburn. She moved seamlessly into her new job as Congresswoman. She was one of only 11 sitting women in Congress in that 79th session, and only 33 women in Congress had been there since the congressional founding and also the women's right to vote. The 11 women included folks such as Maine Republican Margaret Chase Smith, who replaced her husband and later had a distinguished tenure in the U.S. Senate, New Jersey's Mary Teresa Norton, the longest sitting female member, having served 30 years and the first woman appointed to chair a House committee, and the glamorous Republican Clare Boothe Luce of Connecticut, an actress, playwright, and wife of publisher Henry Luce. One reporter described Pratt's path from secretary to Congresswoman as storybook fiction. No other woman in Congress took that path. Rather, they were often women who either filled vacancies for families or achieved notoriety through their experiences in philanthropy or the theater. While Jane's rise to office sounds like a plot for a mid-century obscurity to fame movie, the reality was she had prepared for more than 2 decades to become a respected politician and advocate for the people of North Carolina. Speaker of the House Sam Rayburn assigned Jane to 3 committees: flood control, territories, and pension. The Flood Control Committee was where she would make the greatest impact directly on North Carolina. She was key in securing the enabling legislation for a flood control project in the Yadkin River Basin, known as the Carscott Dam and Reservoir in Wilkes County. Jane spoke at a Senate hearing in support of the project. You see, the bill had already left the House by the time she was sworn into office. A flood control expert at the Senate hearing stated, "Jane Pratt made the best brief for flood control heard in this Congress." In the end, the project was approved by the Congress as part of the River and Harbors for Flood Control Act on July 24, 1946. The Carscott Dam was completed in 1962. Jane made a valiant effort to attend the Carscott dedication, traveling all the way to Hickory, but the bad weather prevented her from continuing on to Wilkesboro for the event. Now, moving on to other legislation. Jane Pratt's vote on the Atomic Energy Act of 1946 was clearly the most far-reaching action she took as a member of Congress. Even though she would not be elected until May of 46, she was expected to know, track, and be prepared to vote on major legislation, including the AEA, which was enacted in July. I dedicate a chapter in the book to this historic legislation and the extensive political maneuvering that was required to reach successful passage just 2 months after Pratt was sworn into office. If I may, I want to insert here that along with her work on the Hill, Jane was expected to do her part to support the North Carolina Democratic Party back home. She attended the State Democratic Convention in Raleigh and the Davidson County meeting in Lexington to support general election candidate Charles B. Dean, who had campaigned throughout the summer for the November election. And I have two wonderful photographs of Jane at these meetings in the book. Congresswoman Pratt's constituent service duties meant that she had to balance retention of U.S. defense facilities after the war and respond to constituents seeking fair compensation for property damages incurred from military training operations. She was especially focused on Fort Bragg, now Fort Liberty, in Cumberland County in the neighboring district, as well as Camps McCall and Sutton in her own district. North Carolina had numerous defense installations at that time, so it was important to our state's economy that we retain as many of those as possible. Here she is in a photograph with Fort Bragg Commander General Pearson Menaher, who was a West Point classmate of Eisenhower's and served under Patton during World War II. As Congresswoman Pratt's term ended in early 1947, she had to maintain her federal employment to keep her pension. You see, she was a single working. She and a former North Carolina congressional secretary met with President Harry Truman as she was preparing to leave office. It was very telling that Jane received no federal appointment from President Truman. However, her once fellow congressional secretary, James Webb of Granville County, would be appointed by Truman to lead what is now the Office of Management and Budget. In 1946, Webb was a staffer for past North Carolina Governor and then Treasury Undersecretary O. Max Gardner. Webb earned his law degree while working for Gardner. As you may know, James Webb later became the National Aeronautics and Space Administration's director for the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. NASA's powerful Webb telescope is named for him. What a contrast in career paths for two talented, hardworking people. I also write in the book about Jane's service in the U.S. House with then Representative Sam Ervin, who had replaced his deceased brother in early 1946. He did not seek re-election either. He went back home to Morganton and continued to serve in other public positions, and then, of course, later ran for the U.S. Senate successfully. The biography of Jane Pratt also includes a chapter on three powerful North Carolina women in 1946 and 47, Jane, Sadie McCain, and Catherine Boyd. In the book, I explained how stories began circulating in 1947 about whether Jane Pratt would oppose Congressman Charles B. Dean in the 1948 Democratic primary. Men continued to control the local, state, and national elected offices, even though women were a strong part of the electorate. It's uncertain whether McCain and Boyd were encouraging Jane to run in 1948, but there were signs that they may well have been. Sadie McCain was an effective advocate for public health and education, a Gold Star mother on the Board of Trustees of UNC Greensboro, and vice chair of the North Carolina Democratic Party from 1940 to 44. Catherine Boyd of Southern Pines was a leading influential member of the North Carolina publishing community and a philanthropist. She was known to take stands in her columns on national and state political issues of the day. Both McCain and Boyd had the influence and outlets to promote Jane for elected office. Boyd had the financial wherewithal to jumpstart a campaign budget and lead fundraising. One day in April 1947, the three women visited the state legislature, which was still meeting in the Capitol at that time. It was speculated they were scoping out the possibility of Jane running against incumbent Dean. Boyd wrote about the visit in her newspaper column that week, and I include excerpts in the book. It was written cleverly with humor, yet conveyed clearly her love for this beautiful state. In the end, Jane decided against running. We do not know what actually contributed to her decision. Perhaps Representative Charles Dean had proven to be a stronger person in office during his first term than some had anticipated. Thus, the Democratic Party leaders might have thought, why change a positive trend? For your information, I include bio sketches in the book of other women that were considered most influential during 1946 and 47. Women such as Jane McKimmon, North Carolina's first female graduate and innovative champion of extension education from NC State. Charlotte Hawkins Brown, founder of the Palmer Institute, a highly respected model high school for African American students. And State Senator Sue Ferguson of Taylorsville and Alexander County. She was the only woman serving in the North Carolina legislature at that time. Pratt's decision not to run in 1948 reset her course and returned her to traditional women's career paths in federal government, that is, playing a supporting role in the primarily male workforce. Parenthetically, though, I would say more importantly, Pratt's decision not to run may have altered the course of North Carolina women in politics for a long time. It was a decision perhaps influenced by the male-centric politics of the day and fundraising ability. From 1947 to 1956, Jane Pratt, a single woman, worked in 3 federal agencies to preserve her pension: the Office of Alien Property, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and the Library of Congress. In 1957, Jane was presented with an opportunity to return to Congress, although not as a candidate. She left her job at the Library of Congress and returned across the street to the U.S. Capitol building for one last assignment, serving her beloved state of North Carolina. The irony, or should I say fate, for Jane at that time was she was not going into an elected office, but she would once again become a congressional secretary. She took a job working for Congressman Paul Kitchen, a member of the powerful Kitchen family in North Carolina politics. Jane retired as a federal employee in 1963 after 40 years federal service to the state and nation. She settled for the remainder of her life in Anson County, where she worked for a while for North Carolina Telephone to lead its industrial and public relations program. Pratt's health declined in later years, and she died May 13, 1981. Reflecting on Congresswoman Pratt's story, there's so many questions that I explored and attempt to answer in the biography. What if those 4 women had not attended the meeting in Troy? Why wasn't Jane placed on the general election ballot? How did Jane win by a landslide? Why didn't Jane run in 1948? Why didn't Jane get a federal appointment from President Truman? Why did Jane return to being a Capitol Hill secretary? And why did it take 46 years for our state to elect a second woman to Congress? What was Jane's philosophy on women as government leaders? She didn't as herself as a member of the women's liberation movement. Her possible role model was Mary Teresa Norton of New Jersey, who I mentioned earlier. Norton viewed herself as a member of Congress rather than a woman. She sought equality by reducing the focus on gender. She believed women could leverage their strength if they organized their effort, and as a result, she sponsored successful bills on women's labor and childcare throughout her terms. As I close Pratt's story, I write about her views on women's potential for winning elected office. I also review women's limited progress in state politics, and I offer lessons learned from her career. Jane spoke publicly and answered reporters' questions leading up to and after leaving office. Her general sentiment was best characterized by quotes such as, "Don't sabotage that for which pioneer women have worked so hard." And she would say, "Women have to earn their place. They must prove themselves by sheer determination." She said, "I've seen Phi Beta Kappas, brilliant women, but they didn't have the personality to get ahead. It takes spunk, patience, and tolerance." So as you look at her resume in this slide, it's important to understand that Jane's work in DC over 4 decades had a lasting impact, even though her time as a member of Congress was short. No other North Carolina woman had such a unique perspective on early and mid 20th century politics as Jane Pratt, and no other North Carolina woman had such an opportunity to contribute to the state's future during that historic time. More than 75 years have passed since Jane Pratt was elected North Carolina's first woman in Congress, yet her legacy has all but been forgotten in North Carolina history. No other North Carolina women of Jane's era accomplished what she did. Her work continues to benefit society today, and her legacy is a gift to all North Carolinians. It's unfortunate that Jane Pratt did not write a book about her 40 years in Washington, D.C. Word was she thought about it. If she had, perhaps she would have been a more memorable figure. It's my hope that the biography captures the essentials of what she would have written. Although it was not Jane's nature to seek attention and acclaim, I hope she will now receive the recognition she rightfully earned. So, if you're interested in learning more about Pratt's amazing career and you'd like a unique look at North Carolina's history in the early 20th century from a federal perspective, as Stacy mentioned earlier, the Museum of History's gift shop has kindly offered to sell the book. I hope you will remember Congresswoman Jane Pratt and join me in seeking ways to commemorate her. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Hello, everybody. My name is Allie Tennant. I'm an intern here at the Museum of History for Stacy. Marion, thank you so much for that awesome presentation and stuff. So I'm going to get started with some questions if you're ready. We got actually a bunch in the chat if you would like to go over those first, or if you would want to go over some other questions we have prepared for you. It's up to you.
Well, you're welcome to start with one of yours and then we'll move on to the others.
Perfect.
Take your time.
So one question that we wanted to ask is, why did you choose to write about Jane Pratt? I know we kind of mentioned that in the slideshow and stuff, but what really appealed you to write about Miss Pratt and everything?
Jane Pratt was a distant cousin of mine,
Oh, really?
and I had heard about her all of my life from my mother, but I had never really taken a deep dive into her life. And so when COVID broke out, we were all sitting at home with things to keep us busy. Some others were looking for things to do. So I began a deep dive into her life. I started looking online and didn't find a whole lot except some basic profile pages. And then I discovered that there was a collection at East Carolina that she had donated, scrapbooks with a lot of clippings from her experience during her time in DC and in office. And I thought to myself, this is a story that needs to be told. People need to know about her. So that's why I decided to do it.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's so cool that you got to find that like connection and stuff, and really great that you got to report and share her life and everything. So I'm going to move on to some questions in the chat that are just a couple about what happened in the PowerPoint and stuff. One question that we have is what resources did you find most useful in researching and writing the biography of a Congresswoman? I know we just kind of talked about that when you were saying that you were finding stuff, but you could go into more detail if you'd like.
Well, thank you. Yeah, the Special Collections group at East Carolina had two complete scrapbooks, and they were very full scrapbooks of newspaper clippings. But she and her assistant, I think, kept meticulous records. They had just about clippings from up and down the East Coast during coverage of her nomination and election, as well as correspondence dealing with some, election-related matters as well as office. No, not a lot of personal correspondence. I also found that the digitization of newspapers online was a tremendous resource for me. So helpful. Working through state archives and other services, uh, the, um, the work and the information that I found was very helpful. Also contacted a number of libraries that I found had photographs of things such as floods in the 1916 up in the Yadkin River, just various contexts led me from one part of the story to another, and eventually was able to put it all together.
Yeah, awesome. So we also have another question from someone. I think they joined a little bit late, but they were asking, did Jane aspire to Congress, or was she pressed into service?
I don't know whether she was pressed or whether you call her reluctant or not, but as I mentioned earlier, when Congressman Lambeth announced that he was not going to seek a fifth term, she was certainly at the top of the list of possibilities. She and 16, total of 16 people, one woman, 15 men.
Mhm.
But she decided not to at that point. I think she just thought maybe the state wasn't ready,
Mm.
but or maybe she didn't feel like she was ready, or she was comfortable with what she was doing. As I said, she never really saw it a lot of acclaim, so she was maybe modestly reluctant. But I have a feeling that there were part of her that she knew, and she certainly had correspondence and support from friends and colleagues that said, "You can do this. You should do it."
Yeah. Yeah, so kind of going off that like support and stuff, do you think that she was well received by other members of serving in Congress from North Carolina?
Absolutely, absolutely. She said time and again that she was respected, and I think that's because she had worked with them basically for more than 20 years. She had been there in their daily operations and seen how competent she was. They knew that she could move seamlessly into that job because she knew how Congress worked, how the House worked.
Yeah. So this is kind of like a little history question going on. Do you think Jane Pratt is recognized or celebrated in any Anson County museum that we know of or anything? Do you know anything about that?
The Anson County Historical Society does have some information about her there, and I'm going to be speaking at their annual meeting in November and sharing with them the additional information that I have. Mhm.
Yeah, that sounds great. Um, so this is kind of a question based around her title and stuff. So her title was secretary, but was she really what we call now the chief of staff for the congressman that she served?
I think eventually that's what it turned into. A secretary originally, I mean, she did go to secretarial school while she was on Capitol Hill working in the early years. So she had to learn how to type and use the latest technology like mimeograph machines. But she was originally just a secretary. I think when I say just that I don't mean to put that down at all. There are many. My mother was a secretary. There are many fine secretaries, and they are crucial to the operation, as everyone will know, of an office. But as I think with time and understanding her capabilities, she became more of a chief of staff. However, the Congress members did not have large staffs at that time, so there weren't that many people to manage.
Yeah,
But
awesome.
she was definitely the probably the first person that a constituent would approach coming into an office, and she was often there to help people with their problems.
Mm, okay, interesting. So, someone is mentioning your distant relation and stuff. They were wondering if you ever had a chance to meet and talk with her before her death in 1981.
Sadly, I did not. I did not. She was in DC most of her career. When she retired back to North Carolina, I was a young woman with a vision of what I wanted to do myself. I was moving on and married and just was not around. So I really regret that I never had a chance to meet her.
Yeah. So someone's asking about the donation of her papers to ECU. Why did she donate if she didn't attend there? Do you know like what kind of process that led to and stuff?
I've wondered about that too.
Mm.
Uh, I I'm not really sure how the university system handles that and what path it took, whether it went through the general system first to ECU or if she designated it for ECU.
Yeah. And then last question from the chat that we have is someone's wondering, why did she move to Davidson County or Hickory? Was there any motive there, or do we know anything about that, or just trying to move around and stuff?
I don't think she ever lived in Hickory.
Okay.
Um, she would often be in Davidson County because, let's see, well, she was in the beginning, she was in Randolph County when Congressman Hammer was in office because members of Congress weren't in session as long during the year as they are now. And so when they were out of session, there was still a lot of work to be done for constituents home. And so she would set up residence probably near the office or help run the local office of that congressman during the off season to continue with operations. But she lived in Washington, D.C. the majority of the time. Her younger sister, ended up moving up there to work too, married, and in the end, Jane lived with her sister and brother in D.C.
Yeah. Cool. So now we're gonna move back to kind of the questions that we have prepared and stuff for you. So one of them was there anything about Jane Pratt that surprised you during your research, or that you found interesting that like a lot of people might not know just from first glance?
Well, I just continue to be amazed at the network and her ability to manage as a single working woman in Washington, D.C. through the changes that she had to experience, especially when she left office and managing to stay a federal employee for 10 years before she returned to Congressman Kitchen's office. It demonstrated the network that she had, I think. Uh, for example, with the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the Secretary of Agriculture at that time was an attorney who had helped manage the Resettlement Administration program. So she knew him. So,
Yeah, great. And so, how do you think Pratt shaped North Carolina, kind of in like a short synopsis? And what do you think would be different if Jane Pratt wasn't in office and stuff?
well, I thought about this and I made a few notes. I think she demonstrated that to other women that a woman could win and serve successfully. And then her advocacy for the Wilkes County flood control led to earlier enabling legislation in 1946 than would have probably happened because she took the initiative to go to the Senate, even though she was a new member of the House. She went over to the Senate and spoke to them and managed to get that project included in the bill because it was not in the bill when it left the House to go to the Senate. So I really think she played a very large role in that Wilkes County flood project, and that area had experienced flooding for so many years. But more importantly, I also think it's just her relatively small acts for constituents that cumulatively really help shape the state. And one example I wanted to offer was of a young man that in the 1920s, when she was up in Congressman Hammer's office, she encouraged him to accept a Naval Academy appointment identified by Congressman Hammer and her after the young man was not accepted to the U.S. Military Academy. And he was hesitant at first, but she persuaded him to accept it. And he went on to receive a Bronze Star and later gained the rank of Rear Admiral. So he was then an active member of the UNC faculty and later a state archivist. So it's just examples of individual stories and the people she affected and benefited, I think, along the way. So,
Yeah. Yeah. And so that was a great answer. I think that answered kind of our next two questions about what issues you think that Pratt like is most important for advocating for, which you mentioned the flooding and stuff. So if you want to go into more issues that she advocated for, or like you want to talk more about the flooding, we can, if you want. Yeah.
well, and another thing I don't speak about in my presentation, but I thought would be interesting is in 1946, she participated with Representative Claire Booth Luce of Connecticut and a few other women in Congress to support First Lady Bess Truman's National Food Conservation Campaign. And I considered that visionary. It empowered housewives across the country to make a tangible difference in fighting hunger in post-war Europe by offsetting the demand for wheat and other commodities so that the Europeans who were struggling to put food on the table would have some assistance. And why I say that's visionary is because it preceded the Marshall Plan, which was rolled out by Secretary Marshall in 1947. It really is just an early example of combating food waste and food conservation.
Yeah. Yeah, that's awesome. You see, I didn't know about that. So, I think that's interesting that, stuff that she does is really shaping the way that North Carolina was faced and how we kind of work today and stuff. So, do you think that this shaped North Carolina's involvement with women in politics?
I do. I think that her decision not to run due to the significant male leadership and campaign finance challenges she had may have prolonged women's pursuit of federal office, but she could have had the potential to serve multiple terms, in my opinion, and that may have influenced other women to serve. I think she underestimated her popularity,
Mhm.
but or maybe she just was happier playing a supporting role as an aide. But I think she had the potential to really make a difference earlier for women in Congress from North Carolina.
Yeah. And kind of going based off of that popularity that you just said, how do you think Pratt's experience shaped her trajectory to become a woman and stuff?
Well, with respect to her professional experience, I think her knowledge of the Capitol Hill operations and her familiarity with members of Congress, working daily with them, and the long time work with and for North Carolina's congressional delegation and the Democratic Party leaders assured the leaders that Jane was most capable of completing Representative Bergen's term without any risk. So it her just her common daily experience is really what laid the groundwork, and it also demonstrated the value of starting grassroots type of political activity and working your way up through the system. I don't think there were. She was a rare case, if not the only woman, or who who came to a seat in Congress through an administrative role like that without any family connections or any other notoriety.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for answering those questions. Those were all that we had to ask you. And thanks everybody for responding with your questions in the chat. There was a great conversation going. So I'm going to turn it back over to Stacy and stuff.
Thank you, Allie. And thank you so much, Marian, for sharing Jane Pratt's incredible history with us. This has been really cool to learn about this impactful North Carolinian. And I hope that more folks learn about her through your book and take time to get to know her. What an incredible story.
Thank you. Thanks. Please remember Jane Pratt, everyone.
Absolutely. Thank you guys for joining us today. We hope to see you at our next adult program, History and Highballs, the Evolution of Mortuary Science. It's taking place virtually over Zoom on October 17th at 7 p.m. In the meantime, we hope all of you have a wonderful afternoon and we'll see you soon. Take care. Bye, guys.